Might turn it on when you speak it.
So welcome back, everyone. I'm going to call us back into session. Thank you for your continued attention to this important topic, and we're going to now proceed with our third panel of policy and legal experts in the order in which they will speak. Our panelists are Lena Masri, who is the National Litigation Director and Acting Civil Rights Director at the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR, Shelby Chestnut, the National Organizing and Policy Strategist at Transgender Law Center. Thank you. Kristen Clark, who is the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Andrea Centino, Legislative Staff Attorney with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And Aviva Vogelstein, Director of Legal Initiatives at the Brandeis Center. Just as a reminder to all, I will cut you off after 7 minutes, so I encourage you to stay within the 7 minutes and to watch the system of lights that we have going. And Ms. Masri, please begin.
Thank you, respected commissioners. The Council on American-Islamic Relations is America's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. Its mission is to enhance the understanding of Islam, protect civil rights, promote justice, and empower American Muslims. CAIR is dedicated to the foundational ideal of affording all Americans the freedom and dignity to practice their religion. In fact, CAIR is the only Muslim civil rights organization that provides legal services to all cases reported to CAIR that fall within its mission. Nationwide, CAIR employs more than 40 attorneys who provide free legal and advocacy services to individuals who experience religious discrimination and bias. In the process of providing its services, CAIR also assembles data regarding incidents of harassment against American Muslims, the only report of its kind. In April of 2018, CAIR released our annual civil rights report entitled Targeted, a copy of which is attached to the written form of this testimony. The report documents that the Trump administration's Muslim ban has succeeded in stigmatizing Muslims and demonizing Islam, leading to an unprecedented increase in anti-Muslim activity to never-before-seen levels. The American Muslim community has witnessed an increase in the onslaught of institutional and individualized prejudice against American Muslims in 2017. Since 2014, CAIR has received reports of 16,800 incidents of targeted hate against American Muslims. Between 2016 and 2017, CAIR's records show a 17% increase in incidents of anti-Muslim bias and a 15% increase in hate crimes. Those sharp increases themselves accumulate atop a surge in recent years. From 2014 through 2016, CAIR recorded a 65% increase in incidents of anti-Muslim bias and a staggering 584% increase in hate crimes targeting American Muslims. In 2017 alone, CAIR tracked 300 anti-Muslim hate crimes. The incidents are becoming not only more frequent, but also more violent. Mosques burned down to the ground by arsonists, American Muslims' homes and businesses smeared with threatening graffiti, women harassed on the streets for wearing the hijab or the religious head covering worn by Muslim women, sometimes by aggressors forcibly yanking their hijabs off their heads. In 2017 alone, CAIR recorded 144 anti-mosque incidents. The rise of anti-Muslim sentiment has cost us lives. 2 men were murdered in Portland as they sought to defend a Muslim youth from a knife-wielding aggressor on a train, one of whom we heard testimony from earlier today. There have been Muslims threatened at gunpoint. Muslim children are afraid to go to school, not only because of student-on-student bullying, but teachers-on-student bullying has significantly increased in 2017. Teachers bullying them as terrorists. The chief culprit for this rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes is the Trump administration's various efforts to exclude Muslims from the United States. Courts have recognized the Trump administration's Muslim ban as the fulfillment of then-candidate Trump's call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. In the aftermath of this Muslim ban, CAIR recorded a deluge of 464 incidents pertaining to it in the last year. Even as CAIR has developed its own data set documenting the rise in anti-Muslim activity, CAIR's experience in the community makes clear that incidents of bias are severely underreported. American Muslims often do not report incidents either to CAIR or to law enforcement for two significant reasons. First, members of the American Muslim community fear mistreatment and retaliation from the government itself. 35% of incidents of bias reported to CAIR last year concerned mistreatment by the government, principally by CBP and the FBI. Community members are often afraid to invite the government to probe into the details of private hate discrimination they experience because that very invitation is perceived as making them vulnerable to even worse consequences by the government itself. It doesn't help, as BuzzFeed News recently documented, that politicians in 49 states have attacked Muslims openly in speeches and with proposed legislation since 2015. Second, members of the American Muslim community consider everyday harassment to be so common that they're desensitized. CAIR staff regularly hear of cases in which individuals are harassed but report the incident to CAIR and not to government authorities. This often happens because the victim feels that the treatment is expected and normal, that nothing can be done, that they will not be believed or sympathized with by their broader community, or constant anti-Muslim harassment is to be expected in the United States today. Programs and policies, including the Muslim ban, the terrorist screening database, the extreme vetting initiative, and censorship of Palestinian advocacy, must be systematically documented and challenged. Laws aimed at suppressing Islam must be rejected, and the fact that politicians, lawmakers from city councils and state legislatures to Congress and the President of the United States regularly consider anti-Muslim measures is as good of an indication as any that anti-Muslim sentiment in this country has run amok. The government has a significant role to play in combating hate crimes, but it must first establish trust in the American Muslim community that bias and discrimination will not be embodied by the government itself. For the sake of time, our written testimony does include additional recommendations to the Commission. Our annual civil rights reports also contains additional recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to all panelists that we do have a policy against defamation and degradation, so we need to be careful to link our statements to fact. Thank you. Ms. Chestnut. Ms. Chestnut.
Good afternoon. My name is Shelby Chestnut, a staff member at the Transgender Law Center. Before I begin, I just want to send a big thank you for convening all of these panelists today. TLC is the largest national trans-led organization in the United States advocating self-determination for all people. Grounded in legal expertise and committed to racial justice, TLC employs a variety of community-driven strategies to keep transgender and gender nonconforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation. In the last decade, transgender people and gender nonconforming people have gone from the shadows to the covers of magazines, courtrooms, and television. This increased visibility has also come with increased public debate, legislative attacks on the rights of transgender people, and sadly, deadly violence. Violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, especially transgender and gender nonconforming people, is one of the key civil rights issues of our time, and one that we can no longer ignore. In 2017, according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, we lost 28 transgender and gender nonconforming people across the United States to violence, a majority of whom were Black transgender women, making 2017 the deadliest year on record for transgender people. To date, in 2018, this epidemic continues with the murders of at least 8 transgender people. In a moment where society is seeing the increase in intersections of racism, misogyny, classism, and anti-LGBT policies on the state and federal level, it seems clear that addressing this violence transgender people are facing should be a top priority for everyone, especially the federal government, yet no one seems to be hearing the battle cry. Before we can look at solutions, we must understand some of the sources of this violence. Extreme discrimination in employment, education, and housing lead many trans people to see sex work as their best option to survive. But the criminalization of sex work and legislation like SESTA FOSTA makes sex work extremely dangerous for transgender people, contributing to the fatal violence people face. We must stop advancing policies that put the lives of sex workers in danger, and we must address the discrimination that limits opportunities for trans people and forces them into situations where they're vulnerable to trafficking and violence. Violence at the hands of law enforcement remains a persistent issue impacting the lives of trans people across the country. Law enforcement routinely profile transgender people, especially Black transgender women, and criminalize their survival. And worse, add to the violence and mistreatment when handling the homicides of transgender people and oftentimes misgendering them and perpetuating the narrative that they are criminal and deserving of deadly violence. Intimate partner violence or domestic violence, while an epidemic in many people's lives in this country, is an issue of grave concern impacting many transgender people. Stigma and lack of public awareness that IPV can impact people regardless of their gender identity and sexual orientation oftentimes leaves transgender survivors with limited option for support, despite the fact that federal protections like the Violence Against Women Act includes LGBT survivors. State-sanctioned anti-trans legislation which seeks to dehumanize and limit trans people's access to public accommodations. Much of this legislation is known as the trans bathroom bills, seeks to limit people's access to public restrooms. Far beyond bathroom access, this type of legislation targets trans people's civil rights and opens up the floodgates for broader anti-trans legislation and increases violence towards trans people. We've seen it in North Carolina, Washington State, Texas, Anchorage, Alaska, and now Montana and Massachusetts. When we look at this source of violence and we start to think about solutions, it's clear we have a great deal of work to do to ensure that transgender and gender nonconforming people are central to this conversation. While state and federal hate crime laws were a hard-won battle, aiming to protect many vulnerable populations, we have done very little to increase public awareness for why LGBT people, especially transgender people, are in need of respect and legal protections. State and federal hate crime laws and prosecution are not the answer to protecting transgender communities from violence. Charging one person with a hate crime does nothing to prevent the next murder or increase public awareness on why transgender people are deserving of respect. To take this violence seriously, our country must look at solutions to address conditions transgender people face, especially state and federal elected officials who daily create laws and executive orders that strip transgender people of their rights and dignity. We must work towards a world that values transgender people and one in which the media is uplifting their successes and contributions to society when they're alive and not dead. City, state, and federal funding must be made available to ensure transgender people have access to jobs, housing, education, and we must prioritize prevention programs that promote communities to be accepting and welcoming of transgender people versus criminalizing people. We must denounce the rollbacks and attacks of transgender people's rights and ensure protections like the Violence Against Women Act, HUD's Equal Access Rule, and all federal protections remain in place. Right now, as we speak, hundreds of migrants in a highly publicized caravan wait at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking entry into the U.S. Among the caravan are a number of LGBT migrants, most of whom are trans women and minors who are fleeing violence in their countries of origin. The group was turned away from the port of entry for several days and experienced harassment and extreme violence in Mexico. This past weekend, the LGBT group was repeatedly turned away from refugee shelters due to transphobia and homophobia. After finally being allowed into a shelter, this group was awoken in the middle of the night by armed men who robbed them, threatened them, and then set the shelter on fire. Where's the public outcry for this horrific violence? Why isn't our government intervening? All of us should demand that Customs, Border Patrol, and Immigration Customs Enforcement allow the remaining members of this caravan entry immediately, or we risk them being killed. I want to close today by offering some of the highlights of the amazing work happening around the country to ensure transgender people are not only protected but thriving. Last year, TLC represented Ash Whitaker to challenge the Kenosha, Wisconsin School District, who denied him access to the boys' restroom in high school because he was transgender. We fought and won. Ash is now a freshman in college and living his authentic life. Last month in Anchorage, Alaska, transgender people worked with their allies to defeat an anti-trans bathroom measure despite high levels of opposition. Recently, national domestic and sexual violence advocates across the country called for the continued support for transgender rights and shared steps advocates can take locally to ensure transgender people have access to services and are respected when seeking services. Right here in our nation's capital, Ruby Corrado, a transgender Latina woman, runs Casa Ruby and provides housing and services to transgender people 365 days a year. In Montana,
Sorry, the time is up.
Oh, thank
you
you.
very much. Ms. Clark.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm here on behalf of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is one of the nation's oldest racial justice and civil rights organizations. Founded in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy, our principal mission is to secure equal justice for all through the rule of law, targeting in particular the inequities confronting African Americans and other racial minorities. Over the course of the past year, our work to confront our nation's growing hate crime crisis has been one of our top priorities. We know that the hate crime crisis we see today is not new and is rooted in our country's long and tortured history when it comes to racial animus and hatred faced by African Americans and other racial minorities. Our work is carried out with sensitivity to the legacy of white supremacy and the history of racial violence that loom heavy throughout our nation's history. Our Stop Hate project works to strengthen the capacity of communities to confront hate by connecting them to existing legal and social resources and by creating new resources to fill gaps. Our 844-9-NO-HATE hotline serves as a resource for individuals and organizations who have experienced or witnessed hate, and our www.844-9NoHate.org website provides Know Your Rights materials and toolkits to support communities combating hate and includes information on hate crimes laws and relevant statutes in all 50 states. I want to use my time this afternoon to talk about the unique challenges that we face in terms of the spike in hate activity online. Violent white supremacists and the alt-right are using online platforms to plan, incite, promote, and generate violence at an unrelenting pace. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, part of our work to address this crisis has entailed a concerted focus on how white supremacists exploit racial divisions to reach broader audiences online and in turn incite unlawful, hateful activity. And I want to be clear that there is indeed a meaningful distinction between hate speech and hate activity, especially in the context of the internet. Hateful activity is inciting or engaging in threats, harassment, violence, defamation, intimidation, or other illegal action with bigoted animus. Unlike mere speech, these forms of unlawful conduct are not protected by the First Amendment. They cause tangible and real injury to victims and communities. We believe it is critical to hold private service providers accountable, and I want to talk about some examples of the work that we have been doing in this space. Richard Spencer's altright.com stands as one of the darkest examples of websites that celebrates and encourages racial violence. In the course of our investigation into altright.com, we observed that GoDaddy was providing domain registration services for the site. Altright.com was, in our view, in clear violation of GoDaddy's own terms of service, which clearly prohibit violence, particularly against racial and ethnic minorities. GoDaddy's Universal Terms of Services Agreement required that consumers not use their services in a manner that is illegal or that promotes or encourages illegal activity. Yet we observed countless examples of published content and postings on the site that directed people to, for example, use live ammunition at the border, with the substantial chance that they, being immigrants crossing the border, might lose their life in the process. There were other postings on the site which encouraged violence against women and violence against people on the basis of their religion. We went after GoDaddy and pushed them to enforce their own terms of service, which they did, and altright.com went dark last week. We took similar action against Stormfront, the oldest and largest white supremacist hate site online. For more than 25 years, this is a site that has been tied to the deaths of individuals and other violent activities. The Southern Poverty Law Center aptly describes the site as, quote, the murder capital of the internet. Following our action, Network Solutions enforced its own terms of service agreement and pulled Stormfront offline. Stormfront eventually was resurrected by a private services provider, 2Cows, and we urge this company to closely examine how its services are being manipulated by Stormfront today to incite violence in the U.S. and abroad. In addition to these hate sites, Daily Stormer is a site that has had a particularly devastating impact on young people. In 2018, we filed a lawsuit against the publishers of the Daily Stormer for actions that led to the targeting of an African-American student at American University who had been recently elected as student body president. In this instance, the publishers of the site facilitated a massive campaign of racist trolling activity that disrupted the student's life, impeded her educational experience, made her fearful for her safety, and caused significant physical and emotional trauma. The vicious targeting of the student incited unlawful activity by others online. Using local human rights law here in D.C., we are now pursuing a legal challenge against the Daily Stormer and other online trolls for denying the student an equal opportunity to participate in the very aspects of life we take for granted, including taking full advantage of educational institutions right here in D.C. Where do we go from here? We believe that action must be taken to encourage more victims to report, to push law enforcement to do a better job investigating hate incidents that arise in their community, and that the Justice Department must play a critical role here as well. 50 years after the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, we are still working to fulfill the goals which animated his I Have a Dream speech. We know that nonprofit organizations can't do all of the work on its own, and we thank the Commission for focusing on this very important issue today.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Ms. Centino?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. My name is Andrea Centino, and I'm a legislative staff attorney with MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Founded in 1968, MALDEF is the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization. MALDEF has worked for almost 50 years to confront discrimination and bias wherever they occur. We know intimately how an agenda motivated by hate creates the space for anti-Latino laws, policies, and practices. The rhetoric and messaging that cast Latinos and other underrepresented communities as outsiders and threats are the root of the policies and actions that MALDEF challenges every day. This briefing on the role of the federal government in responding to hate crimes comes at a critical time. In 2016, reported hate crimes reached a 5-year high. The rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and the efforts by state and local governments to enforce immigration laws or to create hostile environments for immigrants leave the Latino community to attack and make it more difficult for our community members to seek protection. Time and again, our community and others have warned the impact that hate rhetoric can have and how it can lead to violent consequences. The federal government and local law enforcement must work to investigate and prosecute hate crimes when they occur, and must send a powerful message to those who might perpetrate hate crimes that these actions will not be normalized. The continual depiction of Latinos as criminals, rapists, and drug dealers, and as threats to the American workforce and the dominant culture, provide those who wish to do us harm the cover that they seek to carry out these biased attacks. The rise in hate crimes against Latinos is certainly motivated by the anti-Latino and exclusionary laws and policies that have long marked our political discourse and that are gaining new steam today. According to the federal government, reported hate crimes in 2016, of those reported hate crimes in 2016, approximately half were motivated by racial bias, and one-third motivated by ethnic discrimination. However, as you well know, federal reporting of hate crimes provides an incomplete picture of the problem that we are dealing with. Local law enforcement are encouraged but not required to report hate crimes annually to the FBI. But since these law enforcement agencies are the largest source of information, their non-participation presents a real barrier to truly understanding the scope of this problem. In addition to underreporting, many times hate crimes are incorrectly identified. which adds to the limitation of that this data that is currently collected. For example, if a police officer arrives to the scene of a location and sees vandalism with a slur or a hate image, they may report that incident as vandalism, but not as a hate crime. It's important that everybody does better to ensure that the jurisdictions and the FBI are correctly identifying hate crimes in our communities. There have been some outside efforts to track and document these hate crimes by news outlets and others. However, this presents many limitations, as many crimes are not reported in the news or made viral on social media. As hate crimes are going up for many racial and ethnic minorities, we must also discuss how race intersects with gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability, and the heightened risk that certain members of our community face. For instance, Los Angeles County noted that after the 2016 presidential election, there were 31 anti-transgender hate crimes, a 72% increase, and that 97% of those were violent crimes. From 2012 and 2016, hate crime rate of violence rose by 96% against transgender people, and by 76% against LGBTQ individuals. Transgender women of color are particularly vulnerable and are disproportionately targeted with deadly violence. In order to have an inclusive discussion about anti-Latino hate crimes in America, we must also recognize and talk about how racial discrimination intersects with sexism, homophobia, and transphobia in our society, which can lead to deadly results for members of our community. MALDEF is also particularly concerned with hate crimes and hate rhetoric in our schools. Immigrant and Latino and other underrepresented students are particularly susceptible to bullying based on their identity. One recent study from 2016 revealed that immigrant youth in the U.S. experience greater rates of bullying than do native-born youth, even when controlling for other factors like age, gender, race and ethnicity, grade level, and family affluence. But Latino students who experience bullying in high school also suffer from significant GPA drops compared to other students. There have been numerous reports of anti-bullying incidents during and after the presidential election. After then candidate Trump called Mexican immigrants racists and criminals, Latino students in Sioux City, Iowa reported being harassed and bullied during school hours as other students chanted Trump's name in their presence. Students at the Rosa Parks Elementary School in Berkeley, California reportedly made statements like, "You live in a Taco Bell and you'll get deported," to other students. And the day after the election, middle school students in Royal Oak, Michigan chanted "Build the Wall," referencing the president's desire to build a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico, bringing several Latino students to tears. The SPLC reported 201 incidents of harassment and intimidation 2 days after the presidential election alone, with anti-immigrant sentiments being the second most reported motivation. MALDEF has created a resource material to educate students, teachers, administrators, and parents about anti-immigrant and anti-Latino bullying and what their rights are. At this critical time, MALDEF is prepared to provide leadership and to work to oppose discrimination and hate against the Latino community living in the United States. We bring cases across the country to resist the tide of anti-Latino sentiment that infiltrates our communities. We have brought litigation on behalf of Latinos that were violently assaulted and detained at work and against anti-Latino agendas at the state and local level, and we remain committed to this fight. MALDEF is ready to meet that challenge before us and to work with you to end hate in our communities and to realize a vision for America that protects every individual from being targeted because of who you are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Ms. Santino. Ms. Vogelstein.
Chair Lehman and distinguished members of the Commission, it's an honor to appear before you today. I'm Aviva Vogelstein. I'm the Director of Legal Initiatives at the Brandeis Center, an independent, nonpartisan institution for public interest, advocacy, research, and education. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. In the course of my work as a civil rights lawyer, I've closely studied religiously motivated hate and bias incidents, with a particular focus on anti-Jewish incidents. Religiously motivated hate is undeniably on the rise in our country, and religiously motivated harassment is infiltrating our nation's schools. Some recently reported incidents help illustrate the problem. Last May, a Muslim student was assaulted at a New York City public school. The assailant spit on her and attempted to pull off her hijab. Last November, in Washington State, a 14-year-old Sikh boy wearing a turban was punched and knocked down by a classmate. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 members of a Jewish fraternity at a Maryland university were followed by suspects shouting, "F the Jews," and calling them an ethnic slur. The suspects then followed the victims and began punching one of the victims in the face. At the Brandeis Center, we've assisted students who've been physically assaulted, spit on, verbally harassed, and harassed on social media because of their actual or perceived Jewish identity. Significant data, as many panelists today have mentioned, demonstrate that the numbers of anti-religious hate incidents are high and potentially rising. It's also important to remember the likelihood that many incidents are not even reported. This problem in our schools has been almost entirely ignored until very recently. Until last month, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights did not collect data on religiously motivated harassment and bullying, although it amassed data on sex, race, color, national origin, and disability. The Brandeis Center has long encouraged data gathering on hate against religious minorities. We explained how it's a tremendously important first step to provide an accurate portrait of the problem and necessary to compel an effective governmental response. In 2016, under the leadership of then Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Catherine Lehman, the Department of Education announced that they would be expanding their mandatory civil rights data collection of America's public schools to include religious-based bullying. OCR's new report, just released, proved the importance of this collection. An alarming 10,848 incidents, 8% of the total incidents in 2015 through 2016, were harassment or bullying based on religion. Now that OCR is finally gathering this information, it has provided us with over 10,000 reasons to take action. It's unconscionable that this category of hate, averaging approximately 30 incidents per school day, 150 per school week, and 602 incidents per school month, has, up until now, been largely unaddressed. Our federal civil rights laws do not properly protect students from harassment based on religion. Harassment and bullying is likely to have lasting psychological and emotional effects on students. Bullying has been linked to many negative outcomes. Kids who are bullied can experience negative physical, school, and mental health issues, and kids who bully others can engage in violent and other risky behaviors into adulthood. The federal government needs to take action to better protect Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, and all students from religiously motivated harassment. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in federally assisted programs and activities, has a glaring omission. It does not prohibit harassment based on religion. The Department of Education has made incremental improvements. In a 2004 Dear Colleague letter, written by then Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Ken Marcus, who's currently the president of the Brandeis Center, OCR clarified that Title VI protected students from certain religious groups that also have ethnic or ancestral components, such as Judaism, Islam, or Sikhism. This guidance was largely unenforced for about 6 years, but in 2010, it was reaffirmed by both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. Though this guidance is currently in effect, there are several concerns. As it's informal guidance, it may not endure through subsequent administrations. Further, OCR could achieve a clearer, more transparent understanding of what is permitted and what is not through providing more guidance. By properly defining what discrimination based on ethnicity or ancestry entails, OCR could more easily identify, address, and prevent such incidents from recurring. OCR should also discuss in guidance, as recommended by the Commission in 2011, the First Amendment implications of anti-bullying policies. The guidance should include that the department's Title VI policies should not be construed in ways that will limit free speech. Moreover, OCR's policies do not protect students from harassment based on religion alone. They require an ethnic or ancestral component. By prohibiting discrimination based on ethnicity or ancestry, without also banning purely religious-based discrimination, Title VI extends greater protections to members of religious groups with shared ethnic or ancestral characteristics than to groups without. All students deserve the same protections. Congress must pass legislation to protect religious minorities from harassment. The new data on religious harassment reveals the extent of the problem. Now that OCR has taken this important first step, we urge OCR to use the new data for its intended purpose, to provide technical assistance where there are patterns of harassment, to assist with investigations in response to complaints, and to compel an effective governmental response. To do so, OCR must both disaggregate the data that has been collected and collect more data, particularly with regards to individual religions, type of harassment or bullying by religion, where the incidents are occurring, and the context behind each incident. This data could be useful for federal investigations and NGO research, but only if more details are added. To help curb religious harassment and bullying, we urge the Commission to make the following recommendations. Perhaps most importantly, Congress must act to prohibit religious harassment in federally assisted programs and activities. This could be achieved through amending existing legislation, such as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act or the Higher Education Opportunities Act, or alternatively, Congress could introduce new standalone legislation to protect students from harassment based on religion. For OCR should disaggregate existing data and collect additional data on what types of harassment and bullying are occurring by religion, where the incidents are occurring, and the nature and severity of each incident. OCR should also provide clarification and more definitions, and in lieu of time, we urgently need more data, better legislation, and strong enforcement. With over 10,000 incidents of religious hate in our public schools, the federal government must act. Religiously motivated hate is unacceptable and should be combated just as vigorously as all other forms of bigotry. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to each panelist, and I'll open it up to my fellow commissioners for questions. Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your very powerful testimony. We had a lot of discussion earlier in the day about the need for better data collection, for greater participation in that data collection, and of course, I'm not going to talk about any of that. I've been more concerned about how our country has treated both the media and the politicians, the whole notion of what constitutes hate crimes and what helps cultivate the environment for that. And I have a question for you, and it has a legal and it has a, it has a public connotation. When there's an organized pattern of action against a protected group, whether it's the folks at the Daily Stormfront or whatever the heck it's called, or other organizations, it seems like the media has difficulty in calling it. They call it a hate crime, but part of it, to me, it seems like it's a form of domestic terrorism. Now, we don't have a domestic terrorism criminal part of the statute. It's in the Patriot Act, defined for other reasons, but we've only really called, I think, maybe Timothy McVeigh a domestic terror. But there seems to be some reluctance to use that in the context of hate crimes perpetrated against protected classes. And I'd like to get the opinion of Ms. Masri and certainly Ms. Clark about what you think about using that nomenclature more readily for the kinds of activities being perpetrated against protected individuals, as well as whether or not the criminal law itself is sufficient to bring all the tools of the federal government to bear on these sorts of activities.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate your question. It is true. Let's take a step back. Terrorism is any violent activity whose purpose is to terrorize a community. And what we do know is the way that the word terrorism has been disproportionately used against the Muslim community, both in the media by politicians, but also it's resulted in disproportionate prosecutions against the Muslim community. And what that has done is it has fed into the narrative, that the false narrative that all terrorism is committed by Muslims. We also have a larger problem, and that is that the federal government has, in essence, criminalized the Muslim community by creating a terror watch list whose standard in being included into the terror watch list is so low that reasonable suspicion alone is enough to land somebody on the terror watch list. We do know that over 1 million people are on the watch list, and thousands upon thousands of Muslims potentially are on the watch list. And having Muslims being named as known or suspected terrorists without even having ever been charged or committed or convicted of a crime related to terrorism, that also feeds into the public perception that terrorists are all committed.
Whereas hate groups, as defined by the Southern Poverty Law Center, don't get that appellation. They're just called hate groups.
Yes, and the problem is that when terrorism or violence against a community is committed by a non-Muslim, there tends to be a focus on the actual reasons behind that crime. What are the mental health issues that might be in play, the way that that particular individual grew up in his home, in his neighborhood, whether he's been bullied in school. Those are the types of discussions that we really should be having if we want to combat terrorism, if we want to combat hate crimes, is to really look at the root cause as opposed to wanting to fall into a false narrative.
Thank you for this very important question, Commissioner Yaki. Hate crimes are unique. They have a devastating impact on the individuals targeted and on communities as well. And for that reason, domestic terrorism feels like an appropriate way to categorize the level of impact and harm that flow from hate crimes when they occur. The challenge, however, is that in this era we have seen domestic terrorism, the concept, conflated with other things. By way of example, the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Analysis Unit recently issued a report on so-called black identity extremism in our country. This appears to be an effort that takes aim on the work of civil rights advocates. It appears to be an effort that harkens back to the era in which the FBI and our federal government placed a target on the back of Dr. Martin Luther King and other activists. So we need to make sure that if we have an agreement that domestic terrorism is an appropriate way to describe hate crimes that are playing out in our country, that we are very clear and have a shared understanding about what we're talking about. And what we should be directing our administration's limited resources to focus on is the rising tide of violent white supremacy in our country and the increase of hate incidents that are perpetrated against historically protected minority groups like African Americans and Latinos, immigrants, religious minorities, and others. And we need to make sure that we have agreement that we are not talking about African American activists, and that we put to rest this black identity extremism designation, which really should have no place in our democracy today.
Any other questions? Commissioner Narasaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello, Ms. Clark. Your testimony noted that the FBI can support efforts to increase reporting by engaging special agents in charge. What would that look like?
Law enforcement must do more to more effectively combat, investigate, and address hate incidents when they arise. One of the things that we've done at the Lawyers Committee is we forged a partnership with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to help strengthen the way in which local police and sheriff's offices go about combating hate today. But to your question, we think that better training for FBI and our federal law enforcement agencies that are tasked with investigating hate incidents when they arise in our country is key.
Great, thank you. Also, there's been a debate all morning about whether the federal government should has a role in addressing hate crimes, either in the education space or in the general space. And I'm interested in hearing what you think whether there should be a federal role, and if so, what is that federal role?
So Commissioner Narasaki, I would just, to amplify my prior response and address your second question, talk very specifically about the role of federal agencies from A to Z. So U.S. attorneys should be supporting the Civil Rights Division to address and clamp down on hate incidents, whether they on plain side of our nation's schools or in our college campuses and universities. The FBI should be supporting these efforts as well, and there should be a special agent in charge tasked to respond to hate incidents when they occur. The FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services should also be supporting U.S. attorneys' offices in this effort. The DOJ's, the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics plays an important role here as well. But we are at a moment where we observe the federal government retreating from this space, not bringing enough cases, and not activating the vast resources of the federal government to address these incidents, whether they play out at schools, on campuses, or elsewhere in our country.
Thank you.
Ms. Santino, looked like you had something to say.
Well, I just wanted to add to that while I understand that question to mean what would be the role of the federal government in perhaps prosecuting or pursuing cases against hate crime and certainly echo the remarks by Ms. Clark, I also would encourage there to be some discussion about the role of funding to encourage prevention of hate crimes in schools and in other areas of our community, to make sure that law enforcement offices, to make sure that federal agencies are equipped to provide that kind of support at the local level to prevent these types of crimes from occurring, or the type of behavior that can lead to those types of crimes from occurring.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Vogelstein? Is it Steen or Stein? Sorry. Unfortunately, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights didn't send a witness, so we don't have an opportunity to explore from them what's going on. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about what they're doing well and what they need to do better, and also what the impact is of the reported closure of numerous civil rights education complaints on addressing and preventing bias-motivated bullying and harassment in schools might be having on the issue.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. So the OCR just released their data about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were so pleased that for the first time they included their data collection, a mandatory data collection on religious harassment and bullying in public schools. So this is great. What the Office for Civil Rights, what we're recommending they do now is they take this one step further and disaggregate the data that they've collected and also collect more data. So right now there was a question on the form that said, was there religious harassment or bullying based on religion? And then the respondees wrote how many incidents, but it wasn't separated by religion. So we don't know what percentage of those incidents were anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh, anti-Christian, any type of a breakdown like that. We also, we don't know by the report that was released what types of incidents are occurring by religion. So we don't know, for example, if they were violent assaults or verbal harassment or assault with a weapon or whatever it was. We also don't know the context behind the incidents. So these are all important things for our federal government to be able to use to take this a step further and fully address the problem.
Have they given a reason for why they didn't ask the question in a more disaggregated way?
There was, I think that because this was the first year that they did it, they were just collecting on religious incidents in general. And I believe there was some debate when they were asking about whether they were going to be collecting data in 2013 about whether it was disclosing the private information of individuals to be asking these questions. Chair Lehman would probably...
Yeah, I can speak to that if you'd like.
Yeah. What I would like to say is that it's really necessary for our government to be disaggregating by religion and providing this additional information. It's not a question about necessarily what the religion is of the students, but on what religious grounds they were targeted, and that's a really important clarification for proper guidance and enforcement by the government.
So I'd also like to ask that throughout the day, those who oppose hate crime laws, particularly on the federal level, have been questioning whether hate crimes are actually on the rise. In your testimony, you said it's undeniably, at least anti-religious, is undeniably on the rise. Some people have said, well, maybe it's just that there's more people reporting because of all the good work that's being done trying to encourage people to report, as opposed to there's an actual rise. Or they've looked at, well, gee, other crimes are rising and this is rising too, and unless it's rising at a faster rate, then I guess apparently we shouldn't be worried. I don't really quite understand that, because I think then you should be worried about any crime that's on the rise, but I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, thank you. So I've looked at a whole bunch of studies on this across the board, and you're absolutely right that since there is so much that's unreported, we don't necessarily know 100%. But I can say that based on the data, the FBI data, I believe this year there was, I think someone said earlier, there was a 5% increase in hate crimes overall. There was about a 13% increase on hate crimes by religion. There were 50, I think it was 54, over 54% of these hate crimes were anti-Jewish. I think 24% were anti-Muslim. The rest were against everyone else. The anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim incidents have risen significantly since the previous year. I've also looked at surveys by SALT, by the ADL, by the Sikh Coalition, and it appears that the numbers are rising. If it's because there's more reporting than previously, I think it's a good thing that there's more reporting. But every survey that I've looked at shows that the numbers are on the rise.
Madam Chair, am I allowed to ask another question? Sure. So when I looked at the data, I have to say I was a little surprised at what the data was for Latinos, given what's going on in the world. But then I was thinking, I'm wondering how much of that is maybe attributable to the increase in fear of the community, not just undocumented, but those who live with undocumented, because we know many live in mixed households. So I'm wondering if you could tell me whether my instincts are correct, or am I totally off base?
So I think that is correct. And I think that to go to the earlier point, when we're looking at whether or not there's a rise in reporting of hate crimes, when you're looking at a population like Latinos and those individuals who live in a mixed status family, a decrease in hate crimes being reported isn't necessarily going to mean that there is a decrease in crimes overall, but rather, as you've pointed out, there is a very, very palpable sense of fear running through our community everywhere. Part of that is attributed to the broader attacks on Latino and immigrant communities across the country, the attacks on sanctuary jurisdictions. In Texas, in the wake of SB 4, there were drops in reporting to police of all crimes in Latino communities. And so because people are afraid to come forward for fear of either some sort of negative retaliation from the federal government, that they might be subject to removal, that a family member may be subject to removal, or in other instances that are probably very common for many other communities, not wanting to report a hate incident in the workplace for fear of losing your job, which might have different repercussions for you and your family, then we are going to see depressed levels of reporting. I think not just of reporting crimes overall, but also of reporting hate crimes. But I think that, looking at the reports that MALDEF has seen, particularly in the wake of the election, the type of violence that's being perpetrated against Latinos certainly indicates and is consistent with the reports that we have seen that, in certain areas, Latino hate crimes are being reported, or increasingly reported. And so I think that, seeing those incidents across the country where someone is targeted because they're Latino, and the rhetoric that is used used to cast them as an outsider because they may or may not be perceived to be an immigrant, and that is, unpopular from our federal government, I think certainly contributes to all of that.
Thank you. And one more?
Okay, this is your last one.
Okay, sorry. Ms. Chestnut, so I'm struck by your very strong statement that from your perspective, a hate crime law doesn't help. And anti-Asian violence is something that actually brought me into the movement. And one of my frustrations was that really it was hard to get people to see those kinds of crimes committed against Asians as a hate crime, because at the time, Asian Americans weren't really being even thought about, because it was a small population. And on top of that frustration was the media did not cover those hate crimes. You would not see it on Good Morning America. You would not see it on nightly news. At best, you would see it in a local paper, and probably not even on television. I worked very hard to get those crimes seen, because I thought it was very important for people to understand that, in fact, you're being targeted as a group, right? It's not you being targeted as an individual. And to force people to see, in fact, that that was happening and to get those stories told. So, so I wanted to kind of better understand, because I will say that having worked with victims of anti-Asian violence, I do feel that, you know, it's more important to work on trying to stop it from the beginning, because I learned that even if you prosecute someone and put them away, you can't put the family back together, right? That family, that community is irretrievably broken. So I get the fact that laws enough are not enough alone, but I just wanted to probe a little bit more sort of where that comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it sounds like a lot of our work has similarities, and I think from a trans perspective, it's important to note that, like, we don't even know how many trans people exist in the United States, and certainly the media is doing very little to cover sort of trans people in a healthy manner. It's, if you ask sort of most Americans what they think, how they've seen trans people portrayed, it's a sex worker, it's when they're dead, it's as a criminal. You know, and much of our work at the Trans Law Center is how do we make sure that society understands the value of trans people and sort of what they're adding to this society as a whole. You know, and that said, it needs to come from an abolitionist framework. And for me, something that I think really shifted personally for me in my mind was a number of years ago, there was a young woman, her name was Ilan Nettles. She was a 20-something transgender woman in Harlem, New York, and she was killed because she was trans. She had been on the street at night. A young man, Ilan Nettles was African American, as was the man who killed her. He saw her on the street, he catcalled her, thought she was really cute. He didn't know that she was trans. She died. He started getting made fun of by his friends, and he pushed her to the ground, and she died of a trauma to her head. You know, the police arrived, they didn't realize that she was trans, so the hate crimes unit wasn't called at all immediately. They figured out she was trans by the time they got her to the hospital. This young woman was on life support, and it took about 6 months to find the man who had harmed her and ultimately killed her. And I remember sitting in the courtroom with the victim's mother the day that the sentence came for this young man. He's 24 years old. He's going to spend 12 years in prison. He was not charged with a hate crime. He was charged with second-degree murder, I believe. You know, and some of the community's outraged. They're like, "Why isn't this a hate crime?" And in my mind, I'm thinking, this young man's going to go to prison for 12 years. He's known to have killed a trans person, so he's not going to be targeted that he killed a trans person. He'll be targeted that he was attracted to a trans woman, and he got busted for it. He'll probably get raped in prison. He'll get harassed the whole time he's there by other inmates, and he'll get released, and he'll, one, not think any differently of trans people to value them. His friends will probably taunt him for the rest of his life, and if anything, escalate violence when they see another trans person in their neighborhood. So for me, I think what was most devastating of that is that it was a community that was impacted by it. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a white man attacking a community of color. It was a young black man attacking another young black woman. And what are we doing as a whole? And I don't want to target at one specific community. This is an epidemic. How do we think about that education and, you know, make people understand that violence against trans people is harming us all, and that trans people, they're not making national news at all. I mean, anywhere. And it's kind of our responsibility to start talking about that. And at a very young age, young kids who are trans should be able to go to school and be safe, and they're not. And then they're living up to be, you know, to grow up and be killed. So I guess to me it's all very connected, and how do we start that early intervention?
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Dykeman?
Yes, thank you for your testimony. This question is open to anybody who wants to take a cut at it. I'm trying to understand what the root cause, what we understand the root cause or causes of underreporting to be, because I don't think that we can really move the dial until we have a deeper understanding about why it is that jurisdictions don't report these types of crimes. And so if you all can help us understand what those causes are, we might be better able to recommend things that can move the dial. But if we don't know, if we don't have an understanding of what those root causes are, I think the pattern is probably going to continue.
I mean, I can quickly just say this. I think there's fear of reporting to law enforcement or official government agencies of not being believed or being mistreated as you're reporting. But I think the reality of it is find me an LGBT person who hasn't at some time in their life been called an anti-LGBT epithet or worse, and just normalized it and started to sort of say like, well, you know, at least I wasn't like beat up today. I was just called like an anti-LGBT epithet while walking to work. So I think part of it's shifting how society wants to think about these things, but also encouraging people not to normalize constant harassment.
And I can add to that as well. From the Muslim community's perspective, a lot of the hate crimes that are occurring are a direct response to a lot of the sentiment that's been pushed by politicians and elected officials by the government. And there's also a perception of government policy specifically targeting the Muslim community. And so as a result, there is a genuine fear among Muslims of reporting any hate crime that occurs because they fear additional consequences from their interaction with government officials. On the other hand, anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, harassment, intimidation has become so commonplace that people underestimate it, or they set it aside as a common occurrence. They don't think that their individual circumstances are important enough to report it or to bring it to anybody's attention. So it is important that the government first establish trust in order to increase the reporting. There's also other mechanisms of getting reports, and that is through state and local agencies that do reporting but are not, their records are not being transferred into any type of central database. There should be a focus on the federal government to create a central database from all the rights commissions, state agencies that are collecting, that will at least increase the numbers that are coming in.
I can add to that. So our federal civil rights laws don't properly protect students from religious harassment. OCR has extended the protections of Title VI to protect students based on ethnicity or ancestry, but not specifically religion. So through clearer guidance from the Department of Education and through legislation that protects religious students from harassment, there could be better reporting as well as better enforcement of incidents.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Commissioner Adegbile. I think that this is a very important issue that requires work from a few different angles. Building trust with communities that tend to be targeted by hate crimes is key. And one way for law enforcement agencies to build that trust is to ensure that their ranks reflect the diversity of the communities that they endeavor to protect and serve. They should meet and convene regularly with communities, hear from them, understand the ways in which they are impacted. Law enforcement stands to learn a lot from communities through meaningful and real engagement. I also think that it is important to be very intentional about wanting to hear from victims. Through our work with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, we've had law enforcement share that they had not done enough to make fighting hate crimes a priority. And last summer, through our work with that group, they passed a resolution that made fighting hate crimes a priority, which by itself sends a strong message to the communities that you care about hate crimes and want to hear from people when they are victimized. But on a more micro level, I think it's important when we're talking about hate crimes inflicted on undocumented and immigrant communities to have a very clear and unmistaken policy that someone's status will not be used against them if they call to report a crime or an incident. So there are many ways that we can work to attack this issue. Trust is paramount, but policies, training, and engaging with communities, I think, are equally important parts of the strategy as well.
Ms. Clark, if I could follow up for a moment. Earlier, I think the DOJ representative shared some of this notion about engaging with communities, as did some of the other law enforcement officers. My understanding is, and I don't know if I have this right, but my understanding is that the future of the Community Relations Service of DOJ is in some doubt at this point, and I'm wondering if that is consistent with this notion that in order to discharge the duty of connecting with communities, taking apart an apparatus that was established as part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act for purposes of having outreach into communities and providing a mechanism for positive discussion that is not just treating DOJ as only an enforcement tool. I'm trying to figure out how this lines up with that professed need of law enforcement.
The U.S. Department of Justice is our nation's largest and most important federal law enforcement agency, and for sure, the Community Relations Service is the one part of this vast agency that has been tasked for decades with connecting with communities, resolving conflicts, bringing communities that are divided together. We deemed it devastating to hear that the budget has been wiped out for this critical part of DOJ, and we think that it turns the clock back decades in efforts to ensure that the Justice Department is able to step into communities that have been impacted and devastated by hate crimes, and really get in there and work together to bring people together, to promote unity in a way that is so needed on the heels of a hate crime. This is the peacekeeping arm of the Justice Department, and we hope that in the weeks ahead we'll see Congress working with DOJ to reverse the decision to wipe away what truly is one of the most critical parts of our U.S. Department of Justice.
Thank you.
Commissioner Chladni.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question only because we talked a lot about data in the last couple of years and reporting going up in the last couple of years. What have those numbers and reports look like, say, for the last 10 years or 20 years? Have they been on the increase or have they been on the decline? Are you talking about the last 2 years because there was such a tremendous percentage increase? If I could have some answers, I'd appreciate that. If you know what the numbers are or what the percentages have been, or if you can lay your hands on those numbers. Okay.
So I'll just say, from our review, according to BJS statistics from 2004 to 2015, the average number of hate crimes reported was about 250,000, and that annually, each year. Wait, that can.
Sounds like a lot.
I'll review if that was actually annually. But we saw that it looked as though, from 2004 to 2015, there were changes, there were fluctuations up. Our understanding is that hate crime reporting didn't dip significantly, or there were no significant kind of decreases, but rather there were changes, particularly for Latinos, that there were periods of increased reporting, but never kind of dramatic drops. And so we were always looking at a rate of either a steady level of reporting for hate crimes against Latinos or an increased level for the past 10 years. And we were certainly able to follow up on that one statistic. And then our other understanding is that for the period between 2011 and 2015, the most common motivation for hate crimes was racial bias.
Ms. Vogelstein, it looked like you maybe took out some data.
Yeah, I'll just add something. Well, I took out the FBI data, and I do know that FBI hate crime reporting, what was reported, there were something like 500 more victims in 2016 than in 2015. 615 victims in 2016, and I don't have the 2015 data right in front of me, but it was about 500 less. I will also say with anti-Semitic hatred specifically, the ADL released a study in January, and I believe that they found that that anti-Semitic incidents increased by 59% from 2015 through 2016, or
Right.
sorry, 2016 through 2017.
Well, I understand that. I was just trying to see what the results were the last 10 years.
Oh, so I don't know all of the data, but I do know that this past year of the ADL's report was the second highest number since they started reporting in the 1970s.
Ms. Masri, I'm sure you have something to say.
Yes, in terms of our internal statistics, I can't give you the numbers offhand, but I can tell you that generally what we saw was a spike, an increase of hate crimes post 9/11, and a second spike was post-election last year. Post-election last year, we saw a significant spike in bullying as well. And as I mentioned earlier, specifically teachers on students bullying has spiked in the last year. Generally speaking, since 9/11, hate crimes has been pretty much steadily increasing, with the exception of the spikes that I just mentioned.
I was wondering if because we're running out of time, and I know that the chair is very strict.
It's true, and I have some questions.
So my question is, do you have charts for your individual groups that you represent in this regard that you could submit? Because I think a chart, especially if we could put it in a report of, say, 10 or 20 years of reporting for your, like, religious or Latino or African American or transgender or Muslim, would be very effective in terms of seeing what exactly is happening, because everybody's been talking about data all day, and it would be nice to see it. Thank you.
Can I just, just to go back to the earlier point, the statistic that I cited, it is indeed 250,000 average each year from 2004 to 2015. The data is based on BJS statistics as well as the National Crime Victimization Surveys and other data that the federal government pulled together, and we'd be happy to provide this information.
Thanks very much. Ms. Clark, you testified earlier that we are at a moment where we observe the federal government retreating from its hate crime enforcement work and not bringing enough cases and not addressing hate crimes. At an earlier panel and also in written testimony that we received from DOJ, we heard that combating hate crimes is among the highest priorities for the Civil Rights Division and the Justice Department, and a commitment for the department to use all of our investigative and prosecutorial authority to bring perpetrators to justice. We also heard touting that since January 2017, the department has brought hate crimes charges against more than 24 defendants and obtained 22 convictions. I note that that does contrast with the prior administration's record with respect to hate crimes charges, on average about 32.25 charges per year. So it does look like there may be some decline, but who knows in 1 year. I'm just curious from your perspective from the Stop Hate work that you've been doing, if you could concretize what you mean about seeing the Department of Justice now retreating from hate crimes enforcement, because that stands in pretty stark contrast to the testimony we received.
Right. Thank you very much for that question, Commissioner Lehman, and for your leadership in focusing the Commission's attention on this crisis. Words must be backed by action, and from our perspective, many of the new hate incidents and hate crimes that have been happening across our country over the past year and a half have been ones in which we've seen silence from the Justice Department and silence from our Attorney General. I think that these moments are moments that really require leadership. Require that we have an Attorney General prepared to stand up and use the bully pulpit of the office to condemn hate, to condemn the impact that hate has on communities. An Attorney General who can sympathize with the victims and communities that have been targeted. It is my observation that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has not done enough to use the bully pulpit and unique powers of the office to speak out, confront hate, and to support local law enforcement in investigating these incidents when they arise, or in taking concerted action to have the federal government lead and spearhead more investigations at the federal level into hate incidents that are taking place in our country. That said, I will give credit to the Justice Department for completing investigations that were initiated and started during the prior administration. And I think that those have provided some moments for this administration to essentially take credit for work that was already well underway before the clock started on this new administration's efforts. It is our goal and intention to bring pressure to bear on this Justice Department to stand up to hate. We feel that it is important for the Justice Department to do more than it has presently.
Thank you very much. Ms. Chestnut, you made, I thought, a very compelling argument for focusing on prevention, and I wonder if you could give us some recommendations for what kinds of prevention areas you think are most fruitful or most necessary.
There's been a number of campaigns that have started ahead of sort of states pushing anti-trans ballot measures, and really just public education, because most of Americans, when polled, they aren't against anti-discrimination protections, but when they go to vote, they don't know what they're voting on, and they don't understand what transgender people, who they are and what they mean. So simply like public education campaigns, and I know a number of years ago DC ran one that was quite successful, and it really was just like putting trans people sort of in the day-to-day life, like, hey, I'm trans and I worked with you. California has run a very successful campaign thinking that they were going to have a ballot measure called Transform California, and it was about educating local business owners on like who transgender people are, what they might look like, and that it doesn't really matter that they're transgender, just like don't violate their rights. You know, and I think part of it is pushing the media around these narratives and moving away from this, like, only talk about trans people when they're dead. You know, certainly people like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox have done wonders to sort of bolster this, like, image of trans people. But the reality of it is not everyone is a Janet Mock or a Laverne Cox, and understanding that you might have trans people working at Bank of America or at McDonald's or right here at the Commission. And educating people, you know, like asking people's pronouns at work is a huge step. I was impressed when coordinating this. Staff member was like, "Can I ask your pronouns?" You know, that's uncommon in my experience. So things like that, which are just simple and actions that people really overlook. The healthcare component is huge. You know, like what we might lose with healthcare for trans people. It's like, never mind transition-related care. It's like people's just ability to go to the doctor and be safe is what's the priority here. So, you know, general education that can start in elementary school and go all the way up. And frankly, young people are leading the charge here right now. There's amazing young people around the country organizing, and adults need to catch up to them.
Thanks very much. Commissioner Kirsner, will be our last question.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everybody. Just one quick question. Is there any better database for assessing the rate and number of hate crimes than the FBI's hate crime statistics database, or putting it another way, the Bureau of Justice Statistics database, either from a quantitative or qualitative perspective?
I mean, an initiative that a number of groups in this room were part of was the Communities Against Hate, which was an initiative that started right after the election. I think did a much better job at bringing groups together. I mean, I'll be frank that the FBI statistics don't include trans people, so we don't have any idea how many trans people are harmed. And part of it's like including communities that might otherwise be excluded from this information. So I don't know the website, but I'm sure one of these groups, which I'm sure, I think some of these groups were part of, would know the web address.
I'll just add that OCR's mandatory civil rights data collection could be tremendously helpful, especially if more data is added for religious harassment.
I'm certainly a fan of that database, I will say. But Ms. Chestnut, if I could, having said that was going to be the last question, I'm going to ask you one more. Robert Musi, I think, testified earlier today about the regular receipt of data about trans hate crimes or potential hate crimes coming in, I think, on a quarterly basis to the DOJ. And I wonder if you have any information about whether the DOJ then collects that and reports that out in a way that is accessible to others or usable for the DOJ itself.
I can't speak to how it is, but my guess is that it's coming from local law enforcement agencies. And the problem with it is one, there's grave concern that law enforcement should be collecting information on gender identity or sexual orientation to some matter, given the nature in which trans people are targeted by many different aspects of the community. But then two, oftentimes they're not collecting information on gender identity. So like it might be a biased crime related to their LGBT identity, but we have no sense of knowing how it's then broken down. So the data, we need to start counting trans people in the first place before, like in other areas of the world, before we can then assume that that information's actually making it, because it's not.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you again to this very powerful panel. We really appreciate it. We are going to come back in 10 minutes at 2:30 for our next panel of the day.
Thanks for coming, dear.
I mean, I would say that.